Paglia. Now, if you've listened to me before, you know that Camille is one of my favorite leftists. Camille, and by the way, her last name is spelled Paglia, Camille Paglia. And Camille is best described, probably, in my opinion at least, Camille is a leftist. She's an academic. She's a feminist. She is, I suppose she's a liberal in the modern sense of the term liberal, although she kind of espouses positions and some critical thinking that shows that people on both the left and the right can find some common ground when it comes to what's happening in our politics and in our culture. So anytime I run across an article where Camille has done an interview, it always grabs my attention. She sometimes does actual live interviews to video, but most of the interviews that Camille does are Q&A sessions. She prefers that people email her questions because it gives her the opportunity to really think critically about what she's going to say and to use just the right words to get her point across. So long story short, I came across this article doing show prep today, and I wanted to share it with you because I want to give you an example of how somebody on the left, someone who probably doesn't agree with you and me on a lot of issues, actually agrees on some fundamental problems and some fundamental principles that if we don't address, the culture in the United States, the politics in the United States, the government in the United States is leading us down a road to tyranny. Now just think about that in and of itself. Here is someone who is from academia. She's a leftist, she's a progressive, she's a feminist, and she's actually worried about tyranny. How many times have I talked about freedom of speech and how the freedom of speech movement kind of started out in Berkeley in the late 1960s, and now all of a sudden the same people that were all for freedom of speech and individual liberty and that everybody should be able to kind of live a libertarian life have all kind of gone to this attitude of, no, we want the government to intervene in almost every aspect of our lives because it's the government that's going to save us from ourselves. So Camille was asked a question about, does the deep state exist? And if so, what is the deep state? Now, I don't like to read to you, but I want to read this to you because I don't want to miss anything, but I am going to comment on it as I go through it. Camille writes in this email response, the deep state is no myth, but a soddened, intertwined mass of bloated, self-replicating bureaucracy that constitutes the real power in Washington, D.C., and that stubbornly outlasts every administration. How many times have I described to you the permanent civil service, the permanent bureaucracy? That's what Camille is describing right here. A bloated bureaucracy that, irrespective of who is in power, actually exercises the real power in Washington, D.C. And here's why and how they exercise that real power. So you have a newly elected congressman, a newly elected senator, in fact, for that matter, a newly elected president. So they bring in their people, they hire their own staffs, they hire cabinet secretaries and undersecretaries like I was. But those people who come in with a preconceived notion of what they want to accomplish. But the permanent bureaucracy, the deep state, as the popular term is for it today, is already in place, already executing on contracts that were probably bid out a long time ago, have already adopted policies that they're comfortable with, and the last thing they want to do is see some political appointee, some undersecretary come in and want to change things. Or for that matter, a new U.S. senator comes in. Well, that new U.S. senator may get their own staff for their offices, but when it comes to the committee staffs where the real work is done, those committees are staffed by permanent bureaucrats who have been there. I can recall, I don't know which committee it was, but I remember one particular committee staff director. He was in his 60s, and that's all he had done since his 20s. He had been working on that committee for 40 plus years. Now, who do you think has the institutional knowledge? Who do you think is going to try to steer things the way he wants things to go? That guy that's been there for 40 years. The new U.S. senator that shows up and brings a staff from his home state to try to help, they are dependent upon some guy like that to feed them the information about how things go on. So when Camille writes, the self-replicating bureaucracy that constitutes the real power in Washington and that stubbornly outlasts every administration, she's absolutely spot on. But then listen to this. As government programs have incrementally multiplied, so has their regulatory apparatus, with its intrusive Byzantine minutiae. You know, I've tried to explain 1,000 times that a government program is like a cancer. Once it takes hold, it metastasizes, and getting rid of that program is probably one of the most difficult, if not near impossible jobs in Washington, D.C. And it takes a concerted effort. An undersecretary like I was can't just summarily turn off a program. It takes the Senate Oversight Committee. It takes the House Oversight Committee. It takes the Office of Management and Budget, OMB. It takes a coordinated effort among all these different groups to try to get rid of a program. So rarely are programs dispensed with. Those programs just continue to grow and grow. Then she says this, recently tagged as a source of anti-Trump conspiracy among embedded Democrats, the deep state is probably equally populated by Republicans and apolitical functionaries of the Bartleby the Scrivener blandness. Its spreading sclerotic mass is wasteful, redundant, and ultimately tyrannical. We agree on something. Someone who's a feminist, who is way over here on the left, is saying exactly what I've been saying over here as a constitutionalist, conservative libertarian, that the road to tyranny is paved by all these good intentions, that Congress comes up with a program, that program gets administered by the executive branch, they have to do that with bureaucrats and civil servants that get hired, that can rarely be fired, and then that program grows and grows and grows. And according to Camille, which I've been saying too, its spreading sclerotic mass is wasteful, redundant, and ultimately tyrannical. You know why? You think about how what we've upended. I don't care whether it's the IRS, it's the Environmental Protection Agency, it's the Department of Agriculture. You can take almost any bureaucratic organization, and they have criminalized violations of their policies, of their regulations. So what should have been a civil matter now becomes a criminal matter. And people don't realize that you probably are violating one of these policies and regulations and you're not even aware of it. But if a special counsel, if a U.S. attorney that doesn't have anything else to do, an assistant U.S. attorney, if they decide to start digging deep because somebody in the deep state has said, we want to go after this individual, that's exactly what they can do. And that's how it gets to tyranny, which is what Camille Paglia is saying. Then she writes this in response to the email about the deep state. I have been trying for decades to get my fellow Democrats to realize how unchecked bureaucracy in government or academia is inherently authoritarian and illiberal. She's making the case that we make, that all these bloated bureaucracies are inherently authoritarian, they're illiberal, they are anti-conservative, they are anti-classical liberalism, they are, as she points out, leading to tyranny. Then she makes this historical comment. A persistent characteristic of civilizations in decline throughout history has been their self-strangling by a slow, swollen, and stupid bureaucracies. When somebody tells you that there's no critical thinking left and that those on the left are just mindless idiots that are just clamoring for greater government control, most of them are. But what I want to point out is there are some really serious critical thinkers on the left that actually agree with what you and I say. She continues, the current atrocity of crippling student debt, as an example, in the United States is a direct product of an unholy alliance between college administrations and federal bureaucrats. A scandal that ballooned over 2 decades with barely a word of protest from our putative academic leftists, lost in their post-structuralist fantasies. Yeah, it's a lot of academic language, but what she's saying. This is how the bureaucracy infests and they work with other bureaucracies. So all of a sudden, instead of having student loans in the private sector, the Obama administration, in cahoots with Republicans and Democrats, privatized or took that all to the government side. It's all now government-controlled student debt. How much more tyrannical can you get than that unholy alliance? It's like crony capitalism, except that it's being conducted within the bureaucracy. Then she says, political correctness was not created by administrators, but it is ever-expanding campus bureaucracies that have constructed and currently enforce the oppressively rule-ridden regime of college life. Wow. She's basically pointing out that all of these rules about what you can say or not say, what speakers you can hear and not hear, how you conduct yourself on campus, how if you are under the old Title IX rules, which are being challenged, that if you were accused of some sort of sexual misconduct, that you were presumed guilty until you proved yourself innocent. How much more un-American can you get than that? And that's what she's saying. And I just want to stop with this. In answer to the question about the deep state, she concludes with this paragraph. In the modern world, so wondrously but perilously interconnected, a principle of periodic reduction of bureaucracy should be built into every social organism. Freedom cannot survive otherwise. I guess if you looked upon Camille Paglia as an old 1960s hippie, I must be an old 1960s hippie too. Because you know what? We're both saying exactly the same thing. She's saying it from a left of center perspective. I'm saying it from a right of center perspective. And we both recognize what the problem is. And the only solution to that is what's going on in the political parties. The upheaval in the political parties, the upheaval in this country right now because people are sick and tired of the political parties and their inability to address these kinds of problems will indeed lead to tyranny. And now we've got somebody on the left and the right, me and Camille Paglia, saying exactly the same thing. I'd encourage you to read this. Go to spectator.us and look for the article is Camille Paglia. Hillary wants Trump to win again. There's a good teaser too. Thanks for listening. I'll be on the air in a few hours.